Kane Pixels is a director, music producer, and VFX artist who made the Backrooms and the Oldest View series, as well as fan animations for Attack on Titan and some other personal video projects of his. These series are fantastic and unnerving and really showcase Kane's talent for VFX and storytelling. The Backrooms and the Oldest View. I mean, I'm not talking about this video. Although, it is pretty harrowing. Only someone like Kane can make a room unsettling to look at or a sculpture of a giant be nightmare fuel, as I'm sure another creator would agree.
What's behind door number 1? Where'd he go?
But before I keep going on my tangent of Kane's work and how hyped I am to see more of it, I wanted to talk about something that's been burning a hole in my brain for a few weeks now. I have been going insano style levels of theorizing, and I'm confident that I'm at least on the right track to figuring out the mystery of the life form and the mystery of the green light, and its broader implications within the complex and the rest of the world. Before we get started with the video, I highly recommend you go over to Kane's channel, subscribe, and watch the Backrooms series in its entirety to get the full experience and have sufficient context for what I'll be discussing. And also go sub to a second channel, not Kane Pixels, because there's some hidden lore stuff in a playlist of his, and I'll be going over certain episodes while only briefly referencing others since they support my crazy ramblings. But I promise you, listening to me briefly summarize some episodes from the series will not give you the same impact or understanding you would have from watching the series yourself. Alright, to start, I wanted to clarify some things. Kane refers to the Backrooms as the complex for the most part in his series, so that's what I will also be referring to it as. And of course, our stick buddy here is referred to as the Lifeform by Kane, but it's known by other names like Bacteria or Howler from the Backrooms fandom. And with that out of the way, let's get into my first theory regarding the Lifeform. I wanted to cover my theory on what the lifeform is, where it may have come from, and my prediction for where I think Kane will take the lifeform in. So, what is the lifeform? Well, according to Kane, we don't know. Seriously, Async is completely in the dark about any details regarding the lifeform outside from its existence and some of its more terrifying properties.
When it comes to the life forms, how would you describe them?
I would say the complex is a very big place, and we don't know where these life forms come from. We don't know if they arise individual of each other or if they're all the same. It could be speculated that every one we've seen is all the same one. They've been observed to run at the camera person screaming, and the screams are pretty terrifying. And in found footage, you see it grab the cameraman.
This terrifying, tall stick figure of a creature has only been seen a few times in the series so far, with these appearances being in found footage number 1, Pitfalls, and found footage number 2. But if my theory is correct, then this tall, lanky creature is definitely not the only form it's presented itself in. And I'll elaborate on that in a bit, as I wanted to go over each of its confirmed appearances so far. Starting with found footage number 1, the first episode in the Backrooms series, and the first episode showing the time distortion occurring in the background, as the date on the clackerboard, July 4th, 1991, and the date in the description, September 23rd, 1996, don't match up. In found footage number 1, we see Kane's self-insert wandering around the complex, and I only say that this is Kane's self-insert because the name on the clackerboard says that the camera person is Kane. He goes down a hallway until he suddenly turns around, and we can see something that seemed to be watching him quickly retreat behind the corner. Kane, however, doesn't seem to notice this and continues to explore. He then comes across a set of arrows, leading him to a wall with drawn-on eyes, a window, and writing that reads, "God closed his eyes," and "Don't move, stay still." There's also some barely legible text just under it to the right, and while I can't be too confident in what it says, it looks like it says it hears, at least part of it. We hear a sudden noise behind him, and we get to barely see what exactly has been stalking him, and even worse, it's running right for him. As Kane is running, he looks back and we see the lifeform suddenly round the corner. Kane continues to run away from the lifeform, and keep in mind the way this particular lifeform screams. After continuing to dodge the advancing lifeform, Kane comes across this particularly crazy room that seems to only be made up of doorways, and as he looks around, we see our little buddy right behind him. And not to kill any suspense, but if you look closely, you can see that it's not actually moving. It's just T-posing towards him. Which, when you think about it objectively, it's hilarious, but the idea that I found it scary at first and I never noticed that it was T-posing until Kane brought it up in one of his prior live streams, that really bothers me, but in a good way. I'll say this time and time again, but Kane, you do a really good job of scaring people. He turns around to see the lifeform about to close in on him and drops into the hole, ending up in an area that looks like a fully realized version of a famous liminal space image. After continuing to make his way through the complex through more settings, we hear Kane cough. Keep this in mind for later. He then comes across a fire exit door where we once again return to the main area of the complex, much to Kane's dismay.
You gotta be kidding me.
After wandering around for a while, Kane peeks down a long corridor as he seems to hear something. A chair is suddenly thrown against the wall and Kane turns around to make a run for it. He then comes across a gap in the wall where it seems he can take refuge, and we can see the lifeform's broken, janky movement, almost as if it's learning how to use its legs. The lifeform seems to stop at the entrance of the gap in the wall, which only supports my speculation that the third obscured bit of writing on the wall said, "It hears," and as Kane tries to muster up the courage to take a steep drop, this happens. And that is all we see from this first confirmed lifeform sighting. So you can immediately see that while yes, the idea of a stick figure with a weird cowbell looking head might not be the first image in your head when you think of a monster, its nonsensical appearance, the unknown nature of the creature itself, and the setting it inhabits, as well as its hostility and almost desperate attempts to grab Kane make it a horrifying entity, and one that still bothers me when I think about how and why it can even exist. The next appearance of the lifeform takes place in Pitfalls, which takes place on May 6th, 1990. In this video, we can see 4 researchers venturing into the complex with the researcher operating the camera named Marvin Lay. Once again, the setting here is so well crafted. The way Marvin looks up to the observation deck and we see an advisor looking down towards the threshold is really cool. And of course, the transition from the research institute into the complex is even cooler. I love the way that the movement cycle of this one researcher here is so fluid and natural, and it looks like actual human movement. After venturing into the complex, they follow a permanent guideline and check on the equipment for a few minutes, taking up the time to set up a tether line before continuing. As our researcher group wanders through the complex, we're treated to some uncanny environmental imagery. The group then comes across a room with a series of pits in the floor interconnected by walkways of varying widths, and on the other side of these pits there seems to be a door. The research group remarks on the nature of the pits, having a sharp drop-off but ending at an angle. They deliberate on whether it's worth it to go check out the door on the other side, and Mark Bloom, another researcher, volunteers to go look. We see Mark shakily make his way across the pits until he reaches the door and goes through it. Here we can see a green light coming from just beyond the doorway, and Mark remarks in astonishment, telling Marvin to hurry and bring the camera.
Oh my god. What do you see?
Everything okay?
Marvin, get the camera over here.
Across?
You're fine, just hurry.
He seems to be hurrying him along, and as this happens, we get a flash of backwards text reading. While data could be inferred from these readings, nobody knew what would actually be found on the other side. Marvin then falls down a pit and ends up in a lower section of the main complex with more dilapidated yellow-green wallpaper that's peeling near the baseboards. Marvin, a little banged up, assures his team that he's okay and to just work on getting him back up because he can't reach the hole he fell out from. After waiting for about a minute, we suddenly hear a loud yell for help.
What was that?
Marvin notifies his team about what he hears and says he wants to go and see if they need help. As Marvin turns left, we see an unsettlingly tilted hallway with a small gap in the wall. Marvin crawls through it and ends up in a neighborhood setting shrouded in red light and what looks like a night sky above him. His team urges him to come back to the hole, as it shouldn't be long until they can get him back up. Marvin insists and says,
But what if Miller's right about the Null Zones?
His team relents and tells him to keep them updated and to hurry. Marvin slowly makes his way down the street, and we can see just how uncanny and weird this neighborhood is. It looks like a normal neighborhood, but the placement in between two giant walls with a tunnel opening that leads to seemingly nowhere is another example of how something human can look so violently inhuman. As Marvin approaches the house at the end of the street, we hear what sounds like screaming coming from deep inside the house, and as he goes to investigate, we see several mirrored road signs. I'm not exactly sure what the reason for this is, but I feel like they have to mean something. Marvin traverses down the long and narrow hallway until he enters a derelict-looking room more reminiscent of the main area of the complex. We can see that there were indeed people here, and from what we heard earlier, we can assume that there were at least 2 survivors stuck down here. There's a backpack, a pair of shoes, 2 blue chairs with one knocked over on its side, and there's a pile of numbers on the ground. We can hear what sounds like the same voice that was calling out for help earlier talking. As Marvin peeks around the corner, we can see a tall figure off in the distance, and the gravity of the situation finally settles in as he says this.
Marvin,
That's not a person.
what is it?
That is not a fucking person!
Marvin manages to escape from the lifeform pursuing him, and his team is able to send down the tether, letting Marvin reach and climb back into the hole he fell out of. Once he's sure that he's sufficiently safe, we can hear his shaky breathing and he coughs. I'm still not entirely sure if this particular cough is from him sprinting away from the lifeform, or if it relates to my theory in general, but we'll explore that more in a while. Finally, in found footage number 2, which takes place on August 19th, 1995, we follow someone who fell into the complex after discovering an area where things seem to be no clipping out of reality. As our unnamed character walks around the complex, we see another example of how much weirder the complex can appear to people, as we see giant rooms with huge ceilings and oddly proportioned furniture. Tall chairs and a random couch can be found throughout these rooms. As she continues to wander through the complex, she comes across the familiar yellow walls and a very odd sight. A car crashed into the wall ahead of her. A realization sets in. Not only is she now possibly not alone, but she also now has to hope that this person is still alive. She investigates the car for a few seconds before noticing a handprint on the wall. Given its color, it seems to be an old bloody handprint with more markings leading towards a room. I want to note that Kane also said this section of the complex is modeled after a more liminal version of his house.
This is based on what?
A version of my house.
Oh, wow.
More liminal,
I like that.
per se,
Interesting.
if you will.
Limited.
Which I think is pretty neat. Our wanderer comes across a room at the end of the hallway after following the trail, and we can see what looks like some weird organic growth spanning the ceiling, walls, and the floor. Our wanderer remarks on the growths and asks aloud if they could be plants. Venturing deeper into the room, our wanderer focuses on a framed portrait until she hears something shift to her left. She turns around and this happens.
Whoa, what the fuck? What?
She runs through the complex and we see a quick peek of a green light and a passage ahead of her, before she turns to the right and runs through the way she originally took. As she tries to avoid the lifeform chasing her, she jumps down a hole going through 2 weird rooms with a glowing green ladder area to her right in between them. However, the lifeform is insistent on catching up to her and has dropped down to follow her. She continues to run away and finds a hole in the ground with debris and a glowing green light, but runs away as she has no time to look inside. She continues running through the complex, and as she finds a narrow hallway to take, she realizes that she's cornered in a room. As she accepts her fate, the room is suddenly engulfed in what looks like cracks with green light emanating from them before the camera cuts out. However, we then cut to a setting of someone's house with this video playing on their TV, meaning someone found this camera and witnessed what happened to this person. That is the end of all the confirmed lifeform sightings so far. So let's go over what we know about the lifeform based off of their sightings. From what we've seen, the lifeform entity seems to share a similar appearance through all 3 videos. However, the second and third sighting of the lifeform show them being significantly taller and more steady on their feet than the one we saw in found footage number 1. We also know that they each sound differently, but the one thing that they all have in common is the fact that their cries and roars sound human. A corrupted and twisted version of one, sure, but a human nonetheless. Pitfalls featured signs of survivors living in the house, plural being the distinction here, but we only see one life form here. Found footage number 2 showed that they seem to be able to enter a dormant stage and essentially root themselves onto surfaces and continue to grow and spread. This is a lot of information so far, but it's not enough to make a clear conclusion as to what exactly the life form is. However, I think given everything we know so far, just based off of these sightings alone, that the life forms are the amalgamated remains of the people who no-clipped into the complex. It explains why we see signs that people were around, but we never actually see any people aside from the researchers and the found footage of people who had already succumbed to the complex. It also explains why they sound so human. There are 2 videos I didn't bring up before, and that's because there is no confirmed lifeform sighting in them. However, they help connect more dots together. And I really want to stress the emphasis on confirmed, but I'll explain why in a second. Anyway, the 2 additional videos I wanted to bring up are Missing Persons, which takes place on February 3rd, 1990, and Motion Detected, which takes place on March 5th, 1990. Missing Persons starts with a short montage of missing persons posters scattered around, one featuring Nicholas Bolton, another featuring Margaret Watson, one featuring a 2-year-old boy named Ellis White, and another one featuring Janice Scott. A graph then appears, showing reported missing persons cases remaining consistent until a short spike at the latter half of 1988, which coincidentally occurs after Async's 3rd test of the magnetic distortion system on July 2nd, 1988. Keep in mind that when we see Async establish a link to the complex, it's the 6th test. And if you notice, that smaller spike isn't the only spike we see before October of 1989. We see the graph begin to spike in July before it increases steadily for a few months, and then has a drastic drop-off in what looks to be November or December of 1988. Since we know that 3 more tests occurred after this, we can try and look for any anomalous increases, and that should be able to tell us how successful in their tests they were before October. It seems like March was the start of a new batch of missing person cases, as it steadily increases until it plateaus and then has a sharp drop-off a few months later. However, it doesn't last long, as we can see what looks like the 5th test may have occurred in July of 1989, and we see just how close they got as the amount of missing person cases began a steady spike before finally passing the blue bar and experiencing a drastically sharp increase in October. The confirmed dates of the tests match up with the increases in missing persons cases. The video then cuts to a research team making their way through the complex. Given how early this is in the timeline, we see that there hasn't been a permanent guideline set on the ground yet, suggesting that this is one of the first few recorded expeditions within the complex. As the group walks in silence through the complex with the tether line in tow, our cameraman comes across a dim section in the ceiling only to look up and see a higher floor of the complex. After continuing to walk for a bit longer, they begin to round the corner and come across something on the other side of the room that they're facing, and this is what they have to say.
Stop. Hold it. I don't know. I've never seen this before. It may just be part of the environment. But it makes no sense. Why would they be identical with you? This makes no sense. This wasn't in the last report? No, this is definitely new. It's organic. Is some kind of fungus?
After this, the video then cuts to a quick shot of a bacterial colony and a blue screen with backwards text that reads, "If anybody, blame him." So Async seems to only have recently started their expeditions into the complex. They seem to have a very simple SOP compared to what we see in later videos and what I can only imagine will be shown to us in future content. They seem shocked to have discovered the body, but it does seem like they've at least seen or been in that room before. Without a date of their last expedition, however, we can't really pinpoint a possible time frame as to when this person disappeared and perished in the complex, but we can at least guess who this person was, and I think that this person was Nicholas Bolton, the first person on the poster we saw earlier on in that episode. Moving on to motion detected, which takes place about a month later on March 5th, 1990. We open with a shot of the entrance to the complex through the threshold before we cut to the inside of the complex, where it looks like researchers are beginning construction of what looks like an outpost within the complex that connects to Async. We can also see 7 cameras are set up in key points and facing at different angles along lateral division A. Each camera is set up to send out an alert and begin recording when motion or substantial noise is detected. A diagram of these camera positions are then shown. We then cut to a researcher looking over the camera equipment before they crouch down to camera level and zoom in on a corridor before the video then cuts away again. After this, we get a compilation of all the alerts that the cameras picked up, and they are as follows. At 7:39 p.m., 3 researchers pass Central Division D. At 8:26 p.m., the 3 researchers return through Central Division D. At 9:01 p.m., a supervisor passes in front of camera 6. At 9:14 p.m., we hear the threshold barrier close. At 1:06 a.m., an unknown noise is detected. At 2:13 a.m., the microphone fails, but there is no detected motion. At 3:53 a.m., motion is detected. This last shot is so unsettling to me. And I mean, like, what's new, right? But really, look at this thing leaning over the corner, as if it's looking to see if anyone is there before sneaking away. But I think the most unsettling thing about this is that those things look like a pair of human legs. So I do believe that motion detected does at least support my theory that the lifeforms used to be people, as this image we see here could be a proto-lifeform, or a body actively undergoing the process of turning into a lifeform. However, we can't see more of it to be able to make a clear distinction. Missing persons also seems to support my theory as well. Given the spike in reported cases during each of the tests Async conducted, as well as the researchers coming across Nicholas surrounded by organic growth spreading across the wall and the floor. Keep in mind the size of this growth for now, by the way. But if we can guess that the lifeforms are the altered bodies of missing people who fell into the complex, that still leaves us with the question of how exactly their bodies are being transformed. To get more context for that, we need to look into the video Autopsy report, which took place on February 5th, 1990, and is the video that takes place just 2 days after the events of missing persons. Autopsy report opens with a shot of a lab, and we hear the report given by the researcher begin. We hear that this person was an 18 to 20-year-old male, and that the time of death was 5 days ago on January 31st, 1990. However, due to the severe tissue damage in the body, it's hard to give an accurate estimate. The researcher says the most likely cause of death was malnutrition. I think it's dehydration, more specifically, since you can't survive without water for too long. And, well, there are no vending machines in the complex unless...
This is Ivan Beck's vending machine.
Anyway, we see a close-up of the body, and the researcher was honestly putting it lightly when he said severe tissue damage. This body looks abnormal, and not in the way that bodies look uncanny and abnormal during decomposition, but things on his body appear to be shifting and moving. It seems like he has these black growths or cracks or holes in his skin or something. His forehead on the right seems to be slouching, kind of like it's being molded like clay. It's hard to tell, but his eye is still there, if not shrunken and possibly compressed. His lips appear to have receded as well, and it seems like there's more patches of this weird growth on his clothes. It's pretty clear that this poor guy's in a rough state, and this is reflected in further findings. The researcher then states that after recovering most of the digestive tract, they were able to observe the state of decomposition in different areas. He notes that it seems like somehow portions of the body simply stopped decaying and were sustained, while those other areas with more severe damage were overtaken by cultures, and after taking samples and running tests, they at first thought it was an aggregated collection of Pseudomonas Fluorescens, but were able to determine that it is closer to a mutated strain of Bacillus. I think it's interesting that they mentioned Pseudomonas Fluorescens, and I don't think I've seen anyone else mention this other bacteria species in other theory videos on YouTube. Pseudomonas Fluorescens is a bacteria species that is found in soil, water, and plant surfaces. They're rod-shaped and are a non-spore-forming, gram-negative species of bacteria. While for now it does seem like Bacillus is the bacteria species we're dealing with, keep the Pseudomonas in mind for later. The researcher then says he doesn't know what to make of these findings, and then asks,
Mr. Beck, may I ask where this subject came from?
We cut to black and are then shown a small TV set that seems to be flipping through a random assortment of images. There's quite a bit of them to go over, but a majority of them consist of diagrams and drawings of bacteria, bacterial colonies, and their structures, as well as images depicting historical human feats, images showcasing pollution, natural disasters, celestial bodies like planets in a galaxy, and we also see a drawing of an infant and a picture of a woman, what seems to be a graph with the record line spiking up and then seemingly curving backwards, a lab with an async, what appears to be a contract, a document that appeared to be a report on the complex itself, the threshold, and the complex from first contact with a sunset overlaid on top of it, and this, a possible depiction of abnormal human amalgamation. It seems this highly mutated strain of Bacillus appears to be overtaking the bodies of those who succumb to malnutrition and dehydration, feasting and multiplying at rapid rates thanks to their mutation. It also explains the presence of that weird organic growth that the researchers came across during one of their expeditions into the complex, as when enough bacteria forms to become a colony, they will create a biofilm. Biofilms are structured communities of bacteria attached to surfaces. Sometimes these biofilms can contain multi-species communities where they interact through physical contact, quorum sensing, and metabolic cooperation. Biofilms are formed to enhance survival and persistence of bacteria colonies no matter the environment. Let's dive a bit more into what exactly this bacteria strain is. Bacillus is a rod-shaped, gram-positive bacterium that is capable of producing endospores. Bacillus is commonly found in soil, water, air, and the gastrointestinal tract of humans and animals. It's also known for its resilience and adaptability to various environmental conditions. Bacillus also has the ability to form endospores, which are dormant, highly resistant structures that allow the bacterium to survive in harsh environmental conditions. There are reported uses for this bacterium in studies. In fact, it's been found to be capable of utilizing a wide range of organic compounds such as carbon and energy sources, and because of this, it's often used in industrial and biotechnological applications, including enzyme production, probiotic and antibiotic study and production, and has been shown to be a model organism for studying bacterial sporulation. These endospore structures allow bacteria to withstand extreme temperatures, desiccation, exposure to chemicals, and other harsh conditions that would normally be lethal to the vegetative cells of the bacteria. They're composed of several layers, including an outermost protein coat, a cortex layer containing peptidoglycan, a spore coat, and an inner membrane surrounding the core. The core of the endospore contains the bacterial chromosome, ribosomes, and essential enzymes required for metabolic activity, and are formed through a process called sporulation or sporogenesis. This process is triggered by environmental stressors such as nutrient limitation, high temperatures, or exposure to toxins and radiation. But nutrient limitation is the main stressor to focus on here since nothing normally exists in the complex. However, under favorable environmental conditions, these endospores can form vegetative cells through germination, which is the activation of specific enzymes that degrade the protective layer of the endospore, allowing the core of the spore to rehydrate and resume its usual metabolic activity, with the new bacterial cells growing and reproducing. Pseudomonas bacteria have a rod shape, just like Bacillus does, so it's not unreasonable to believe async would have made a simple mix-up, especially since the events of Autopsy report take place so early in the timeline we have so far. However, Pseudomonas is a gram-negative bacterium, while Bacillus is a gram-positive bacterium. Both bacterium are found in the same environments, but Pseudomonas fluorescens is known for its plant growth-promoting properties like nutrient solubilization, disease suppression, and stress tolerance in plants. This bacterium also differs in its survival mechanisms, as Bacillus form endospores to survive, while Pseudomonas does not. It instead relies on other survival mechanisms like biofilm formation and metabolic versatility, allowing it to persist in diverse environments. Pseudomonas can be used to study things like bacterial infections or host-pathogen interactions as well. Now, I know I've been tossing around gram-positive and gram-negative as terms, but for those who, like me, did not know what that meant until recently, gram-positive and gram-negative are terms used to describe a type of bacteria based on their response to the gram staining technique. This technique involves staining cultures with violet dye and seeing whether the bacterium can retain the violet dye after the decolorization process. Gram-positive bacterium retain the dye used in the procedure thanks to their outer membrane composed of a thick layer of peptidoglycan, leading to the inability to wash the dye out from the bacteria. These types of bacteria have a cell wall composition like I mentioned earlier. They have no outer membrane, meaning that antibiotics and disinfectants will also be more effective against them. Antibiotics that target the components of the cellular wall, for instance penicillin and vancomycin, are more effective in fighting this type of bacterium. Gram-negative bacterium also have a cell wall, but the wall has a thinner layer of the peptidoglycan coating compared to gram-positive bacterium. However, they have an additional membrane that surrounds the layer, and this secondary outer membrane is composed of lipopolysaccharides, phospholipids, and proteins, which makes for a remarkably distinctive property of gram-negative bacteria. Another distinct difference is that because of the cell wall composition, the bacteria do not retain the violet dye used in the gram staining technique, but they are instead decolored by alcohol or acetone and absorb the counter stain, giving the bacteria a pink or red hue under the microscope. In addition to not being able to retain the violet dye, the bacteria are also often more resistant to antibiotics compared to gram-positive bacteria, making treating bacterial infections caused by gram-negative bacteria significantly more difficult. Like the gram-positive bacteria, gram-negative bacteria also have a variety of species with different characteristics and roles. They also appear in the same environments mentioned for gram-positive bacteria: the soil, water, air, and the human body. However, there are many gram-negative bacteria that are opportunistic pathogens and can cause infections in humans. I think the fact that the researchers thought the bacteria was Pseudomonas fluorescens at first before settling on a mutated strain of Bacillus means that these bacteria may be coexisting or have become a singular community, and more than likely this was done out of necessity. See, there isn't too much information available on the interactions shown between Bacillus and Pseudomonas, as their interactions can vary depending on specific strains involved and the environmental condition these bacteria are in. The complex, being a unique environment that doesn't have food, water, or people to inhabit it, poses a unique challenge for any organism to realistically inhabit it. And that's not even getting into the other anomalous properties expressed in the complex that would make it more difficult to survive in. Usually, when you have two different species existing in a place where environmental conditions are harsh or extreme, these organisms will compete for resources to survive. This is the same in bacterial interactions. Bacillus and Pseudomonas may compete for nutrients and ecological niches in their environment. They can both utilize various organic compounds and can even outcompete each other depending on certain factors like pH, temperature, and substrate availability. They can even produce antimicrobial compounds like antibiotics, peptides, enzymes, and other secondary metabolites that can hinder the growth of other microorganisms, including each other. However, for as much as they're able to compete against each other, they're also able to exhibit synergizing properties under certain conditions. Like I mentioned before, both Bacillus and Pseudomonas are known for their plant growth promoting properties. They help in the production of growth hormones, nutrient solubilization, and disease suppression, as well as enhancing plant growth and yield. However, seeing as how there are no plants in the complex, or at least ones that weren't from the real world, it's difficult for these organisms to realistically survive anywhere too far from a source of nutrients. Even if they wanted to migrate and spread their colonies, they would have to make their biofilms near their initial source of food in order to realistically survive and spread. If you notice, every time we see the life form in the complex, it's always near some sort of sign of previous human life or activity. We initially see the life form after Kane reads the writing on the wall, we see the life form in Pitfalls near the abandoned camp inside the house, and we see the life form suspended by plant-like growths close to where the car crashed into the wall. The last sighting of the life form further supports my theory that these creatures are simply the amalgamated forms of people who perished here. There's a clear sign that whoever was in that crashed car did not make it, evidenced by the leftover markings on the wall and the floor, of course. This life form sighting is interesting as when you initially look at it, you can only just barely make out its broken form. Do you also remember when I told you to keep in mind how these life form creatures sound like? The first sighting of the life form sounded like this. The second sounded like this. And the current last sighting we have sounded like this. Two of them sound distinctly human, with the second life form sounding significantly more human than the other two life forms. I think this is due to the life form possibly being made up of two people. It also explains why it appears that this particular life form is extremely tall, taller than the life forms seen in found footage number 1 and 2. This is also the only other life form that actually had human sounding speech. It was a perfect mimic of what seems to be like what the survivors might have said when they initially landed in the complex after no clipping out of reality, with the only difference in the seemingly human behavior of the life form from found footage number 1 being the noise it makes and the way it lumbers around. This particular life form doesn't have any adult or concrete sounding speech. In fact, it's mostly sustained cries and yelling, kind of like how a toddler would cry. Maybe Ellis, the 2-year-old boy who fell into the complex. It also explains why the life form walks the way it does. Think about the last time you saw a toddler walk or run. Didn't it look something like this? And the life form from found footage number 2 is implied to be the person who succumbed to their injuries from the car crash. If you listen closely in between some of its yells, it sounds like the life form from Pitfalls. This could just be Kane reusing audio to save himself some time, or it could be a sign that the bacteria colonies are spreading to the degree that the colonies who spread were the colonies that amalgamated the bodies of the people from Pitfalls. But how do they spread? Well, Bacillus is capable of biofilm production, but the bacteria can also be airborne. Knowing this, we can assume that all the times we heard researchers creatures and wanderers coughing, it was because the bacteria made their way into their respiratory system and began to irritate it. And as more and more people fall into the complex, more and more life forms will begin to emerge. And unless async somehow manages to create an antibiotic to combat the life form, this may present a unique issue that could run contrary to what async's goals are. So to summarize, my theory is that the life forms are amalgamated humans transformed by bacterial colonies of mutated Bacillus and perhaps Pseudomonas Fluorescens. These amalgamated people are the victims who fall into the complex. Given the nature of the bacteria and its ability to create biofilms to further extend its spread and reach, it's not unreasonable to believe that those who fall into the complex get infected by any airborne bacteria shortly after arriving. These bacteria colonies overtake the bodies of those who perish and transform them into what we see, and it seems like the bacteria is able to hear as well, or at least it's suggested that they're able to. This is because they're adept at finding wanderers even when they don't make noise while hiding. This could even extend to the colonies that create biofilms on the walls and other surfaces, suggesting that any colonies that spread further into the complex could yield life forms that essentially remember what other humans sounded like, and what they've said. And the depressing part? Async is the only one to blame. Or if you remember from Missing Persons, the video said, if anybody, blame him. Him possibly referring to Ivan Beck. And even worse, this bacteria seems to be the least of async's problems. Moving on to my second theory regarding the green light. Viewers with a keen eye will have noticed a green glowing light that has appeared in many episodes of the Backrooms series so far. In order of appearance, we see the green light in found footage, a flash of it in First Contact, a flash of it in Prototype, Pitfalls, found footage number 2, I Remember, and in Overflow. While we've seen it so often in the series, there isn't an answer as to what this green light is. We only have 2 direct acknowledgements of this light. One in Pitfalls when Mark ventures into the room.
Oh my god. What do you see?
Everything okay?
Marvin, get the camera over here.
Across?
Fine, just hurry.
And at the end of found footage number 2, when our wanderer gets caught up in the middle of the green light in the room she's hiding in. So, what is this light, and what does it mean? It's clearly important, but why? To start off, I want to talk about what exactly async is doing here and what their goals are. They describe their end goal as achieving a solution to global storage, overpopulation, and pollution issues, and as described in the third test, they mentioned the idea of having government funding in order to help achieve this goal and help the planet. They hope to do this through the use of the low proximity magnetic distortion system, or the magnetic distortion system as I'll be referring to it from now on. We're not told exactly how the magnetic distortion system works, but if the machine's name and redacted description is anything to go off of, then I think I have a pretty good idea of how it works, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To first understand what it is we'll be talking about, we need to talk about electromagnetic waves and the spectrum. Welcome to Physics 101 with Red. Last time I took physics, I was a junior in high school, and that was almost 10 years ago, so let's see how much I still remember from then. So, what are electromagnetic waves and the electromagnetic spectrum? Electromagnetic waves are a major part of physics. They describe the propagation of electric and magnetic fields through space and are produced by the acceleration of electric charges consisting of oscillating electric and magnetic fields that are perpendicular to each other. Some important and key features of electromagnetic waves to keep in mind are that these waves are dual-natured, meaning they exhibit both wave and particle-like properties. Wave theory describes them as propagating oscillations of electric and magnetic fields that carry energy and momentum through space, while particle theory describes them more as massless particles called photons. So what did I even just say? Basically, you have these two fields, your electric and magnetic fields, and they run perpendicular to each other. Electromagnetic waves propel and exist thanks to electric charges that move back and forth, and this carries energy and information across vast distances, or even condense it in a localized area. For example, radio waves or microwaves, which brings me to my next point about the electromagnetic spectrum. This diagram showcases the full range of the electromagnetic spectrum, its wavelengths, and the amount of energy in each section. It includes radio waves, microwaves, infrared radiation, visible light, ultraviolet radiation, X-rays, and gamma rays. These are listed in order of increasing frequency and decreasing wavelength. Since async is using a machine known as the low proximity magnetic distortion system, we can assume that async is somehow manipulating magnetic fields and electromagnetic waves to find a way to solve the issues they described earlier. It's not clear exactly how they knew to do this or what they thought they would even do or find with this machine. There's just not enough available information with the episodes that are out so far, but we do know that the head of Async, Ivan Beck, has been studying this phenomenon in theory for a long time. The earliest event in the timeline is Overflow, which takes place in 1972. This video is only a minute and 38 seconds long, so I'll be going over the full thing. We open on a shot of the night sky, with some more scenes showing a peaceful and quiet night, before we then cut to what seems to be a power meter with an increasing gauge. There's an advertisement for General Electric tape recorders, but if you look above the ad and to the left, you can see another paper with General Electric on it. There's a cut to black before we see what looks like vibrating orbs of light expanding as a bright light fills the screen. As we see alerts for an overload go off, we zoom in on a pin board as a green light fills the room just off to the left. On this board are several pages and documents. You can make out text in most of these, but the one at the forefront, the one I imagine Kane wants us to focus on, looks like results from an experiment that took place on August 2nd, 1972, and the advisor was Ivan Beck. The screen then cuts to black, and we have a fade-in of the same night sky, only now there's a tilting mirrored effect on the left side of the screen. Keep this in mind for later. For now, let's move on to the next episode in the timeline, Prototype. Prototype is another very short video, so I'll go ahead and quickly summarize this one as well. Prototype opens on a shot of a sunrise before we cut to a warehouse-looking facility leading to what looks like a storage room. And it wasn't until I rewatched this video for like the 10,000th time that I noticed that the ceiling lights here look a little weird in their placement, and the walls are suspiciously yellow. I don't think that this is the complex, but it does seem interesting that there are parallels to the complex so early on in the timeline. Anyway, we then cut to a shot of a marble being held up, and it looks like there are lasers surrounding it. After this, a title screen appears and tells us that the video of the experiment we're watching was conducted on May 10th, 1982, under the supervision of Philip R. Heyman. We do know that Async is seeking government funding to be able to continue their experiments, and Prototype was only 7 to 8 years before their presentation, so it seems like whatever Ivan was experimenting on back in 1972 in Overflow must have been compelling enough to work on for over 20 years, assuming Async continued their work later on in the 90s. Fortunately for him, it does seem like he's managed to achieve that particular goal, but we'll get into that in a second. For now, let's get back to the episode. After the title card, we open on a shot where we see a crude version of what would eventually become the magnetic distortion system. Given the amount of progress they made in the time from prototype to first contact, it's impressive to see how far the research and experimentation has gotten for Ivan. We hear the machine start up, and if you listen closely, it sounds similar to the magnetic distortion system we're familiar with. It's a neat attention to detail. Additionally, the recording begins to slightly shake, and there seems to be black smudges in the image that look like burns after the prototype is turned on. This image damage is due to the electromagnetic energy affecting the recording equipment. We then zoom out and see a component of the machine in front of it, and it begins to spin. We see a light flash from red to green and back to red, having the intervals between them switching get shorter and shorter, and then this happens. The marble is now gone. And even more interesting, the quality of the video improved as soon as the machine was turned off. And before we're able to even ask about it, the episode ends. Did you notice what appeared while the prototype was running? There's a particular green light that shows up here for brief intervals and then goes away. This helps further establish that the green light has something to do with accessing the complex. For now, let's continue to go over the rest of the episodes. I wanted to bring up Archive.tar really quick because while there is no green light appearance, there are two images to talk about. One features an area of the complex highlighted and designated as Null Zone 4. The text beside it reads, "Due to the elevation discrepancy between panels 223 and 224, a small KX field is created." KX refers to an electromagnetic field. We then see an image of what looks like the inside of the threshold construction. The next episode with the green light is First Contact. Hey, it's editing me. I wanted to take a quick second to bring up something that I completely forgot to talk about or even add in this video. In First Contact, if you manage to catch it, there's this image here for a frame that we see, and it looks like there's a line of code here. And after searching this particular code up, I found an article talking about Alice, which is a large ion collider experiment, and it's a detector designed to exploit the physics potential of nucleus-to-nucleus interactions at the LHC. This, being a general-purpose experiment, will allow a comprehensive study of hadrons, electrons, muons, and photons. After getting some info of modifications and added power, we cut to the entrance of the threshold. But before that, there's a small image of a graph in the lower left that looks like energy readings. The magnetic distortion system is then turned on, and this happens. It's here on October 17th of 1989 that Async finally establishes a link with the complex, and it's here that we can also see the green light within the threshold as the 6th test is underway. This process was so intense that it seems like it triggered an earthquake, and researchers were about to turn off the machine, but it seems like one of the researchers noticed the map forming and told them to keep going. Another researcher remarks about the safety of the experiment, and we suddenly cut to a damaged threshold as we get a look inside the complex, and the video ends. This is the 4th time that we have seen the green light in connection to the threshold, and at this point, it's safe to say that there's a direct link between the green light, the complex, and its entrances and its exits, and it certainly is not the last time we will see it. The next video with the green light is in Pitfalls. Since I already went over Pitfalls earlier on, I won't go over it again here in this section, but if you need a refresher, I do have the video segmented into chapters for easy maneuverability. For those who are caught up or remember the events of Pitfalls, you'll remember the door on the other side of the room that Mark went through. We never got an answer as to what was on the other side, and the text that appeared before Marvin fell into the pit suggests that we may not get a direct answer either. But if you're starting to see where I'm going with my theory, then you may also have the feeling that we can at least make a good guess as to what Mark saw. Another thing I wanted to note was that Marvin asked his team,
But what if Miller's right about the Null Zones?
I'll go over what Null Zones are in a bit, or at least what they're implied to be. For now, let's move on to the next green light sighting in the series, found footage number 2. In found footage number 2, we saw the green light in the hallway ahead of where our wanderer is running. Here in this weird hallway with a ladder as our wanderer is running away from the life form, here in this hole in the floor, and of course, here. This last scene in found footage number 2 is the best and most direct look we've gotten at the green light. There's a couple of things to note here about what's happening. The first thing to note is that just before our wanderer turns around to look at the growing cracks on the wall, we can see the walls of the room start to move apart. I'm not too sure what to make of this, but perhaps it's the geometry of the complex itself reacting and warping in response to the green light. Another thing to note is the way the recording ends, and I don't mean it suddenly cuts to a blue screen, but I mean that it kind of looks like she's falling before it cuts out. If my theory is correct, then that may have been exactly what happened here. The last video where the green light appears as of the time of recording this video is in I Remember. There isn't a date provided to us in the description, but we can assume that this more than likely takes place after Pitfalls, and this is due to the same reason I brought up this video in the first place. Towards the end of the video, we see what looks like a researcher walking through the complex, and if you notice, there's a color gradient that goes from red, orange, yellow, and as it peaks in green, the video ends. Did that color gradient look familiar to you? If it didn't, let me show you why it should. The colors here match the first 4 sections of the electromagnetic spectrum, the 4th one being green for visible light. Now, I don't know about you, but this looks pretty visible to me. As of now, that is the end of all the green light sightings in the series. So let's go back to what I briefly mentioned a second ago and earlier on in this section, the electromagnetic spectrum. If you're not familiar with or need a reminder on what the electromagnetic spectrum is, that's okay. I did too. Welcome again to Physics 101 with Red. We're doing a quick refresher on the electromagnetic spectrum. Here's a diagram of the spectrum for reference. As you can see, it is arranged according to increasing frequency and decreasing wavelength, and ranges from low frequency radio waves to high energy gamma rays. The main regions of the spectrum in order of increasing frequency and decreasing wavelengths are as follows. Radio waves. These waves have the lowest frequency and the longest wavelengths. They're used in communication, broadcasting, radar, and navigation. Microwaves, featuring slightly higher frequencies and slightly shorter wavelengths, these are used in microwaves, satellite communication, wireless networks, and radar systems. Infrared radiation. These waves have frequencies and wavelengths between those of microwaves and visible light. They're emitted by objects with temperatures above absolute zero and are commonly used for thermal imaging, remote sensing, and infrared spectroscopy. Visible light. This is the portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that is visible to the human eye and ranges from shorter wavelengths to longer wavelengths, and is the reason we're able to see colors everywhere around us. Ultraviolet radiation. UV radiation has higher frequencies and shorter wavelengths than visible light. This radiation is divided into 3 categories: UVA, UVB, and UVC. UV radiation is used in applications such as sterilization, fluorescence, and even tanning. Of course, overexposure can cause skin damage and increases the risk of skin cancer. Most people are familiar with this type of radiation from sunburn. X-rays. X-rays have higher frequencies and shorter wavelengths than UV radiation and are commonly used in medical imaging like X-rays. They're also used in industrial inspection and scientific research. Gamma rays. These waves have the highest frequencies and shortest wavelengths in the electromagnetic spectrum. These are usually produced by nuclear reactions, radioactive decay, and high-energy astrophysical phenomena like supernova, gamma-ray burst, active galactic nuclei, pulsars, cosmic rays, and black holes. So as you may have already started to piece together, there are a couple of key things to focus focus on. For one, we finally have a name to this green light in the series, which is the visible light from the electromagnetic spectrum. And we also see how involved the spectrum is when it comes to the story Kane is trying to tell, considering the green glow, the existence of the low proximity magnetic distortion system, the deliberate color gradient in I Remember, and the other forms it seems to present itself in, which I will touch on that last part specifically a bit later. Since we already established what the green glow is, let's talk about the magnetic distortion system. So the distortion system is something that has been in the works since at least 1972, way back in Overflow, where it looks like the experiment was in its infancy. We can also guess that this is the first time that Ivan established some sort of minor link to the complex, seeing as how we can see a mirrored effect at the end of the video, which I believe represents the link to the complex. Prototype, of course, features an early form of the magnetic distortion system. However, here it seems a lot more condensed and refined, whereas Overflow featured unstable energy. We can assume Ivan spent at least 10 years experimenting with optimizing the function of the machine itself, and as time went on, he began trying to experiment with using that energy to transport items until about 5 to 6 years later when Async built the low proximity magnetic distortion system. We know it took about a year of consistent testing with the machine before a concrete link to the complex was able to be established. But not only did Async not expect to find the complex in the first place, they also didn't expect any of the consequences that would result from the sixth and final test, much less the prior test. We'll get into the consequences of this in a bit, but for now I want to focus on establishing how exactly the low proximity magnetic distortion system works. We see from presentation that the description of how the magnetic distortion system works is heavily redacted. To measure electromagnetic waves, we can express it in terms of energy, wavelength, or frequency. Frequency would be measured in hertz, wavelength would be measured in meters, and energy is measured in electron volts. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to sit here and try and do math to see exactly how much power and energy is being siphoned into this thing and manipulated. My dyscalculia would never let me. But what I can do is at least provide some possible pieces of the puzzle. If we were to factor in the name of the machine, we can assume that the machine distorts the magnetic field in the immediate area. Not only that, but the description confirms that the field is not just being distorted, it's also being condensed. I think it would help the visualization more if I were to describe this next part with magnets. With regular magnets, you have your south pole and your north pole. These of course join together because opposites attract. However, when you flip a magnet and have two of the same poles face each other, they repel. Think about the last time you tried to force two magnets with the same poles together. It was a lot harder than you thought it'd be, right? Not only that, but you can feel energy and resistance when you try and do just that, to the point where it takes a significant amount of force to get them to even briefly touch, and significantly more to stay together. That's basically what I think is happening. A strong distortion and condensation of the magnetic field, generating more and more energy at a rapid pace until the energy is so intense, the field begins to separate from itself. Of course, Async didn't anticipate their sixth test to result in a powerful earthquake that resulted in millions of dollars of damage, but for what it's worth, I think the earthquake might have been the least of Async's problems moving forward. There's another thing that we have to get into first before we move on to the repercussions of Async's actions, and that is the reason why this test in First Contact and the possible very first one in Overflow were so strong compared to what we saw in Prototype and the third test. See, when you dabble in science that has to deal with manipulating something like magnetic fields, you have to consider the myriad of factors that can influence these fields. Obvious things like microwaves will have an immediate effect, and of course, any environmental or artificial factors that may inhibit the strength or frequency of these fields or waves can also impact the results of your experiments. We see this in Prototype and in the third test, where the camera recording the experiment was affected as soon as the magnetic distortion system was activated. Knowing that, we can tie in something that I haven't brought up yet, but is something that's been hinted at, and that is the role that the sun plays in the story. Now, you're probably a little confused as to why I'm suddenly bringing up the sun when I haven't mentioned it at all except in passing, but the episodes in the series are not the only places where we see references to the sun. They extend past Kane's main channel and go into his music channel, not Kane Pixels. Kane has a playlist on his second channel titled Out of Sync, and it seems to be the official soundtrack to the Backrooms series. But this playlist at the time of recording has 41 tracks, and I assume more will be added. These tracks have titles that have some pretty blatant references and maybe even confirmations to some of my speculations. Some of these even encroach onto two other theories I want to make a separate video on. Some of the tracks I wanted to highlight are What the Fuck Are You Talking About?, October Door 1989, The Same Material, Sundown Entry Wound, and Visible Light. What the Fuck Are You Talking About has a cover image of a sunset. Pretty simple stuff. Moving on to October Dawn 1989. This song has a cover of a researcher with camera equipment pointed at a specific spot, perhaps representative of a researcher trying to catch when a tennis ball no-clips through a natural null zone. The same material has a cover image that focuses on the threshold, and as the song plays, the cover image progressively gets greener and greener until the song ends. Sundown Entry Wound features a sunset as well, but if you look closely, you can see a rare phenomenon that can briefly occur in the last moments of sunset. This phenomenon is known as a green flash and occurs during optimal conditions. Since our atmosphere is composed of several gases, it acts like a prism for light, hence why the sky is blue and changes colors as the sun rises, moves in the sky, and sets. It also ties into the connection to the sun I mentioned earlier, but we'll get back to that in a second since we have one more song to look at, and that is Visible Light. This song features a cover of a drawing of Ivan Beck and is the only known image of Ivan we have so far, but as the song goes on, we can see some colors start to bleed through the image. As the color becomes more prominent, we see it focus around Ivan's head until it completely envelops him in green light, which then fades through those first 4 sections of the electromagnetic spectrum until the song ends. Some interesting stuff if I do say so myself. Not to mention that the song is called Visible Light, and we're focusing on visible light. So what can we take away from all of this? Well, we know Async has been investigating the concept of null zones, which are magnetic fields that somehow allow people to fall into the complex, possibly due to a weakening or overlap of the electromagnetic fields in that area. It's possible that Async was trying to capture a null zone forming in real time to see if there were any visual indicators of its presence. We know for sure that the electromagnetic spectrum plays a major role in the narrative, not just in terms of the magnetic distortion system, but it may also be affecting Ivan Beck directly as well. Finally, we can see how the sun may be connected to the narrative through the presentation of the green flash phenomenon. So how exactly does the sun play into all of this now that we can be sure that there's an established link? Well, I think the reason both tests in Overflow and First Contact had insane amounts of energy, and of course this is factoring in the insane amount of power they had added to the machine in First Contact, I think the sun may have had a hand in why these tests were so volatile. See, in August of 1972, which is around the time of Overflow, there were a series of historically intense solar storms ranging from intense to extreme, like massive coronal mass ejections, solar particle events, and geomagnetic storms. These storms were so intense that it caused damage to satellites and impacted their ability to record images. It also interrupted local electric grids and telephone lines, and even detonated magnetic influence sea mines near North Vietnam. And in October of 1989, there was another period of strong solar activity and flares known as the Halloween solar storm. It's important to note that this particular solar storm had notable effects on Earth's magnetosphere. This increased solar activity also caused disruptions to radio communications and damaged satellites. The magnetosphere is defined as a region around a planet that's dominated by the planet's magnetic field. Earth's magnetosphere extends several tens of thousands of kilometers into space, and is the very thing shielding the planet from solar wind. It's also why we can see aurora borealis as those charged particles from the sun hit the magnetosphere. So if both of these solar storms had massive impacts to the Earth and its magnetosphere, and those impacts happened to be around the time where Ivan was testing the magnetic distortion system, we can assume that the vast amount of solar energy that was hitting Earth at the time would cause the magnetic distortion system to not only detect the increased energy, but use it too. Hey again, it's editing me. Kane, how deep does this go, dude? I'm looking up more things for this section of the video, and tell me why I come across this. What do you mean that the very large solar particle event that occurred in October of 1989 is similar to the one that occurred in August of 1972. Also, you remember this graph that I mentioned earlier from First Contact? I was really curious about it. I decided to do a reverse image search and nothing concrete came up, but when I went to this journal article that I just quoted from, there is a graph that appears underneath the description of this section. I'm not saying that it is the exact same graph from First Contact, but it definitely looks very similar. It could be that this graph here is measuring differential proton fluxes or something similar. I don't know. Okay, that's all I had to say about that. Do you also remember that small spike in July of 1989, where the missing persons cases started increasing before spiking in October? Well, there was also a powerful coronal mass ejection in July of 1989. Conversely, the day the third test takes place, July 2nd, 1988, there were no powerful solar flares or solar activity that would impact the Earth's magnetosphere. This is why the third test didn't result in a direct link to the complex. There simply wasn't enough energy from the sun to increase the volatility of magnetic fields. Knowing all of this, we can confirm that the sun does indeed play a crucial role in the story. So, if there was enough energy to successfully not only rip a hole in reality to establish a link to another one, then theoretically that would mean other areas of the magnetic field would also weaken. And while these may not always have visible indicators, you would definitely be able to tell they were there, because these seem to be what the null zones are. Areas in reality where the magnetic field is weak enough to let someone or something slip through into the complex. We see our first mention of null zones in Archive.tar, where it's described that due to an elevation discrepancy, a small electromagnetic field is created. Our next mention of null zones is in Pitfalls, when Marvin said, "But what if Miller was right about the null zones?" And our first and only demonstration of null zones is in the beginning of Found Footage 2, where our wanderer drops some wood chips, a baseball, and then tries to use measuring tape to see whether she could reach the bottom. As she does this, we see the tape shake before our wanderer and everything around her falls through the floor into the complex. This seems like an example of disrupting the field to the degree that it expands suddenly before swallowing whatever was on it and then presumably reverting to normal. But this isn't the only effect async's manipulation seems to be having on reality. Time is suffering as well. For instance, the first video in the series shows a blatant time jump of 5 years from July 4th, 1991 to September 26th, 1995. Informational video is supposed to take place on February 29th, 1990. But 1990 isn't a leap year, so the 29th of February shouldn't even be a date in that year. Not only that, but in this video, we see our researcher Peter Tench get separated from his group.
Hey guys, do you hear this? Hey!
It's not surprising that you'd be confused on the first watch through, because I didn't even realize what had happened until further on in the series. Now this effect is really cool, but many may not realize what exactly happened to our researcher here. We see Peter manage to make his way back to the threshold, but of course it doesn't look the same. This moment here is the same moment that plays towards the end of presentation, when alarms go off and we see a researcher looking around the observation room inside the complex. And if we compare the dates, that's a 2-month jump forward in time. The last example we have of this is a video that isn't on Kane's channel, and this is called Simpsons. The video starts off with the episode Bart gets hit by a car before we see a glitch and a commercial comes on before it flips back to the show. This commercial is a Spanish commercial from the mid-2000s, which shows just how unstable the temporal distortions are becoming. This is what I think will be the biggest background factor in the fallout that'll be coming if async continues to experiment and investigate the complex in the way that they are. So to summarize, the green light is visible light, the part of the electromagnetic spectrum that is visible to the human eye. My theory is that the visible light is an indication of an alternate exit out of the complex, as the green light has been shown to appear when the link to the complex was initially established. These areas are null zones, and while they may not always have a visible appearance, the green light only appears when energy is actively being manipulated. If energy isn't being manipulated, then these theoretical entrances and exits to the complex would not be visible. While they may not always have a visible appearance, they do explain how people have been unknowingly falling into the complex. The reason for these null zones even existing in the first place is due to the constant manipulation and distortion Ivan Beck and async have been conducting on electromagnetic fields through the development and application of the low proximity magnetic distortion system, a machine that condenses and distorts magnetic fields to such a degree that it seems to rip a hole in reality. The only reason async and Ivan were successful in establishing that link to the complex is due to the solar flares that hurled vast amounts of solar wind and energy and disrupted Earth's magnetosphere, causing the magnetic distortion system to have an uncontained reaction in Overflow, and why the machine in first contact caused the Loma Prieta earthquake. This, however, isn't the only consequence of their experimentation. As we have seen so far, there have been blatant references and hints that there are unstable temporal phenomena occurring. But what this could mean for the future of async and Earth, as well as the narrative, remains to be seen. And I, for one, cannot wait to see where Kane takes this story. And those were 2 of my theories explained on Kane Pixels' The Backrooms series. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I have been thinking about these theories for months now, and I have been poring over everything Backrooms lore related I can find to be able to make these connections. So I hope everything sounded cohesive and made sense, and if it didn't, I'm sorry. I do have 2 other theories I want to make a video on, so stick around for that coming later on down the line. Go subscribe to Wendigoon's second channel, Wendigang too, since that's where I got my clips from the interview and the Gmod livestream they did. And thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you, Kane, for making such an amazing and compelling series and music to go with it. And if you're watching this video, thank you, and hi, you truly are talented, and I can't wait to see more of your content, listen to more of your music, and see your movie and any other big projects you're involved with. But with that being said, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me what y'all thought about my theories. Did you agree, disagree? I'd love to hear what you guys think. But I hope you guys take care, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!